I hate to break up this very jolly gathering. I'm Chris Russell. I'm a science journalist, and I'm at the Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I'm delighted that we were able to do this is the second annual. I don't know whether that means there will be a third one. But last year, John is saying yes. Last year, in the first year, we weren't sure whether anyone would come. They did. And we tackled the topic of the future of science journalism. And we did such a good job in solving that problem that we've now moved on to an even easier problem, denialism, disinformation in the media age, or the age of media, whichever. So I want to introduce Phil Hiltz, who is going to be the moderator this evening. Phil, as was earlier pointed out, helped support this event by supporting the food. But more importantly, Phil Hiltz is a distinguished health and science journalist of long standing. I won't say how long, but we were colleagues at the Washington Post together back in the 80s. Phil went through a couple of papers that you might have heard of, the Washington Post, and then he moved on to the New York Times. And he really covered an array of topics from tobacco to HIV/AIDS. He's written 6 books, and he spent the early 2002-2003 in Africa doing a book on public health. And as a freelancer, we are happy to know that he joined the MIT community, became the director of the MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program in 2008. And I turned over to Phil.
Thank you, Chris. So here we are in Cambridge, in the belly of the beast being science, oddly enough. 300 years, the Great Enlightenment, we've worked on it for a long time. So clearly, I don't need to explain to anybody in this room about the belief in rationality in science. But I do want to give one point. So if humans are maybe 50,000 years old, 60, 70, whatever, 50,000 years for 48,800 years of humanity, our life expectancy was about 25 years, maybe 30 if they're lucky, on average. Then science arrived. So now we have life expectancy 3 times that long. And we are taller by quite a bit. We are 50% more able to do work. In England in 1840, they did a survey of the most robust workers, and they could put in about 4.5 hours of work in a day. So science has changed us. We know science is effective.
Crazy.
So now we're sitting here and we're listening to voices of people who are challenging seemingly unchallengeable conclusions of science that have worked over many, many years. Thousands of lives devoted to small areas of fact that have been established, and people are saying no. And the voices are not just voices of ignorance, voices in fairly high places, voices that are pushing this. So the question, of course, is what is going on? Tonight, I think we're going to hear a few ideas about what is going on. Of course, one thing is there is a lot of ignorance. And then there is a lot of partisan pushing of the ignorance. And so we hear some stories about the kind of crazy ideas and how they're being pushed and what they are from our journalists. And these are all journalists who have many years of experience, who have spent time talking to the denialists, to the friends of the denialists, who have been writing about issues that are connected with it. But we'll also hear a little more depth beyond just the facts and why this is going on, but from Shankar, in fact, all the way down to the question of human belief and what it takes to get somebody to believe something and why sometimes there will be a fact and a belief that are completely separate but are still held. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists, starting with Michael Specter, who is a reporter for the New York Times and for many years, and now a correspondent for the New Yorker and author of the book called Denialism: How Irrational Thinking Hinders Scientific Progress, Harms the Planet, and Threatens Our Lives. Chris Mooney is a blogger and author, and this year a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. His blog is The Intersection, and his most recent book is Unscientific America: How Science Illiteracy Threatens Our Future. And that book follows his previous book, the bestseller, The Republican War on Science. Then Shannon Brownlee, longtime science reporter, and for many, many outlets, including The Atlantic and the New York Times Magazine and others. And her recent book is Overtreated: Why Too Much Medicine is Making Us Sicker and Poorer. And then Shankar Vedantam is a science writer for The Washington Post, and this year a Nieman Fellow down the road. And he's the author of the recent The Hidden Brain: How Our Unconscious Minds Elect Presidents, Control Markets, Wage Wars, and Save Our Lives. So each one is going to speak for a few minutes, picking a little bit on the topic, and then Chris is going to start out with some comments and questions, and then we'll throw it out to the floor and have a discussion. So about 5 minutes each, starting with Michael.
Thank you. I don't usually sit and talk. I like to be in rapid motion. But I'm going to try. First of all, it feels weird to be here because not only were Chris and Phil colleagues at the Washington Post 206 years ago, but so was I. And it's been a long time. And we've never all been on the same panel since. People have tried, but we're very elusive. So anyway, it's kind of an honor to be here for that reason, and to be also with Shannon and Chris. I'll just briefly talk about one aspect of the book that I wrote. There are many aspects of denialism. I wrote the book, it came out 5 or 6 months ago, and I've been, in a witness protection program ever since. Because I have to say, one, that gets me on TV a lot, but still, I have just been amazed at the vitriolic reaction to things that at the very least, you just shouldn't be bitter about. But the vaccine stuff I won't go into, because I know everyone here vaccinates their children. And I won't go into the uselessness of vitamins, because I know you all agree. But I do want to talk about this idiotic obsession with organic food. And I'm sure you're all with me on that, too. The Washington Post, which is never wrong, had a story today that filled me with joy, which basically was quoting which almost never happens anymore. The White House chef came out and said, our garden, the garden that Michelle Obama goes around the country talking about endlessly, isn't an organic garden. What's the big deal? We don't care. And I just, thank God, because it doesn't. And by the way, most of that stuff is organic in the technical sense of the term, but it doesn't matter. What matters is the food healthy? Is it good? Is it grown properly? Is it filled with pesticides? Is it shot with hormones? That's the stuff people care about. And when people talk about genetically modified food, first of all, there's no such thing as talking about that, because every single thing we've ever eaten is genetically modified. Every grain of rice, every ear of corn, every Christmas tree, everything you've ever seen. It wasn't in the Garden of Eden. None of it was. So what we mean by that is genetically engineered food, which is a particularly specific way of being able to move molecules around. And it has great benefits, and it also incurs significant risks. And the problem here is that you get into the situation where the people who believe in science say that all the people who claim that there aren't problems with high-tech solutions to farming and to other problems are backward and foolish. And that's absolutely not true. And then you get all these people who've stuck their head in the earth for too long and think if we would just go back to the old ways, everything would be better. The old ways, by the way, in which, farming was the industry that people had the shortest life expectancy from until 80 years ago. It was the thing you got your arms cut off from. Food, you know, raw milk. They sell raw milk now. People actually spend extra money for raw milk. It made 45,000 people a year sick in the 30s, and it's starting to make people sick again because it's not good for you. Whatever. I have no opinion. But what I'm continually amazed by is the conflation that people make between their objection to chemicals and cancerous products and hormones, which to me seems like an objection worth having, and genetically engineered food, which is responsible for none of that. It's a way of growing food. It's a way of making food. If farmers put too much chemical on their crops, if there's monoculture and then that's bad, that's bad. That's a bad thing. We should change it. If you think Monsanto owns too much of the universe and has a patent on things they shouldn't, and by the way, for the record, I don't, but many people do, change it. It's in Washington that you need to change it. It isn't science. It's not about genetically engineered food. And people go crazy over organics. Organics kill people too. Organic chemicals can be bad for you. Don't make the mistake of thinking that if something is organic or natural, it's good. By the way, I will give all the royalties from my book, both dollars, to any person who can tell me what natural means. Because I don't know. I mean, you can go in a grocery store and you can see it on every product. But if someone can define it in a way that is meaningful to me, I'd be thrilled. Because it's one of the most meaningless words ever used. So I'm going to pass it on to Chris, but I just want to say that this sort of whole denialism thing, to me, it's just people want to believe what they want to believe, and they're afraid of anything that will sort of hammer away their preconceived notions. And we need to stop that because we're hurting ourselves. We're hurting ourselves in lots of ways. Take it away.
Well, I'll explain how we stop it.
Please do.
No. It's great to be here. It's great to be in dialogue again with Michael. We did Slate. We did Blogging Heads, and you pushed me to think about a couple of things. I think about the psychology and also the meteorology of denialism. And I want to give some comments on that. I also just I'll start out by talking a little bit about why people in this room are so different than average Americans when it comes to science. I mean, look at us. Many of you might have a story like this one. This is my story. I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist, and I'm a college lit major. But I had a grandfather, Gerald Cole. He was an evolutionary biologist. He had a huge influence on me growing up. He was this sort of colorful character. You know, he taught me how to draw a bullet hole 3D in a picture of Ronald Reagan. He Chris, you can learn how to draw in 3D. And he had an invisible friend, a guy who followed us around. His name was Chuck Darwin. And you say, let's ask Chuck what he thinks on this question. You know, Chuck would be there at the dinner table with us. Chuck was a bit of a drinker. So I imbibed the whole scientific worldview very young. But most Americans, that doesn't happen to them. Okay? They're not Darwinians. At least roughly half are not. They don't accept science of evolution. In fact, about the same amount, as far as we can tell from polling data, are not even Copernicans. So, you ask people, how long does it take for the Earth to go around the sun? They don't get it right. They don't get it right. So we've missed, much of America has missed the two biggest scientific revolutions ever. And it's not just people who are somehow daft. I mean, ask an intelligent friend who's not science-centered. Go up to them and say, why do the seasons change? And see if they give you the right answer. Because I bet you're going to get, I've tested it many, many times, I bet you're going to get someone's going to think, isn't it because the sun's a little farther, the Earth is a little farther from the sun at part of its rotation and a little closer at other parts of its rotation? That's what they say. And, it's not just that Americans are ignorant about science. It's also, I think, even worse that they're disengaged. They don't feel like it's something that matters to them. They don't feel like it's something close to their lives or what they care about. Only 18% of Americans know a scientist personally. Only 13% follow science and technology news closely. And another polling figure that I find staggering is you call up Americans and you ask them to name a scientific role model. Okay? 44% cannot give an answer. That's silence on the phone. And for the rest, what do you think the top 3 choices for America's scientific role models are? Any ideas? Yes. I heard Whoa. Okay, so you heard my talk already. Yeah.
Einstein, Al Gore, and who?
So Einstein, Al Gore, and Bill Gates. So America's scientific role models are either not scientists, they're not alive. And that's the situation. And then you throw politics into the mix, and that's when it gets really bad, as we know. And I think this is the most interesting area, because here, I think there's something fundamental about the dynamic that we need to understand that we often overlook. And I'm going to give you a little bit more polling data underscored by some really mind-boggling results from Pew. Get this, and maybe some of you have heard this before, but this is my favorite polling data to cite ever. If you are a Republican, then the higher your level of education, the less likely you are to accept scientific reality, which is that human beings cause global warming. But if you're a Democrat or an independent, then the higher your level of education, precisely the opposite is the case. All right? How do you explain that? What's going on there? Because we all think that, the longer you've been in school, the more you've learned, you become more scientific in your thinking, you become more rational. No, it doesn't work like that. In fact, the smarter you are, then the better you are at gathering information that agrees with what you already wanted to believe anyway. And the better you are at arguing your point, and the better you are at confirming your biases. And in fact, when arguments come at you, you've already got an armada of counter-arguments, and they just go glancing off. And that's the dynamic for so many of these issues. That's how it works. So I think we have to think about the role of human nature in feeding denialism, and what can we do about that, because we all seek out the facts that support what we want to believe anyway. And we all doggedly reject in some aspect of our life or another, or argue back vigorously against information that contradicts an existing worldview, not just with respect to science, but with respect to our personal relationships, what have you. It's certainly not just global warming. Let me bash Republicans again. On Iraq and WMD, they were much more likely to believe that there was WMD in Iraq long after it was discredited to the Democrats. Why is that the case? It's because of this effect where we reaffirm our presuppositions. And that's really just the beginning of the problem, because not only is this a part of human nature, but you then have to throw together human nature with the modern media system, which has got a fundamental difference from the media that we had in, say, the 70s, the early 80s, the, quote, golden age of television, when really there were only a couple of channels that everybody watched, and everyone got the same steady stream of news. Well, cable came along and obliterated that, and everyone gets to choose to pay attention to serious news or not at all. You can watch the Food Network, you can watch, or you can find ideological news. And then the internet came along, and it fractionated the audience even further, and so everyone's self-selecting into little pockets of information, and they're going for the stuff that they already agree with. So this confirmation bias, this sense that we're going to, reaffirm ourselves, now we've got media that perfectly allow us to do it, and we don't even have to read the stuff that the other side is saying. Or maybe, we go to the place where our side is, and they tell us to crash a poll or go attack the other side, and so we run off over there for a little bit, and we drop some bombs anonymously, and then we come back to where we feel good and where everybody agrees with us. So that's the dynamic, and this powerful ideological filtering effect that goes on, I think, is critical to fueling the fact that essentially today Americans with different political leanings construct different realities, and they do this based on their selective media diet. So how on earth do we reverse that problem? And Michael, we did this Slate dialogue, and you quoted a beautiful passage that I'm now quoting regularly. It's from John Milton. Yeah, Areopagitica, do you remember the one?
Yep.
And he says, let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. And my problem is, there is no free and open encounter today. Is there? I mean,
cynic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And the truth doesn't just rise to the top because you put it out there. You got to contend with these two things, human nature and the modern media system, which provide a double whammy, and they smack truth down again. And so my closing argument is that people who care about science, care about rationality, want to raise the level of science literacy, science education, we got to stop ignoring this sort of fundamental reality of who we are and how we think and how we gather information, and kind of got to give up on, frankly, the Enlightenment. The idea that, I'm not kidding, because central to the Enlightenment, and that's Milton is a little ahead of it, but is this idea that the truth triumphs. Everybody becomes a better critical thinker as society advances, and we become more reasoned, we become more knowledgeable, and then our public policies work better too, right? And it's not like that. We have to work with the media we have. We have to work with the brains that we have, which are
Oh.
evolved brains.
Somebody got out of bed on the wrong side.
And we have to seek realistic change. So, and that's a process that I feel like people who really care about science have not yet fully accepted that they have to engage in. So yeah, okay, that's pessimistic. But I'm done. My 2 cents.
I leave you alone for 2 months.
Shannon.
Well, you kind of got me down this path a little.
Good.
Anyway.
So I write about medicine, and I've been writing about medicine for a long time. And I want to tell you just a little bit about how I kind of had an epiphany about 10 years ago. I spent 10 years writing cover stories for a news magazine about the latest and greatest wonderful new development in medical research. And I started writing about something that was a little bit off the usual track, which was I was writing about PSA tests, prostate-specific antigen testing. Every man in this room who's over the age of 45 has probably been told that he needs to have a PSA test because it detects prostate cancer earlier and therefore leads to a lower risk of dying of prostate cancer. So I started writing this story that said, you know what, the prostate-specific antigen test isn't so great. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that it's leading to a lot of harm, that it leads to men being treated for cancers that they would not have been harmed by, and the treatment itself is harmful. And I took my story in to my editor, I turned it in, and he basically says, I don't believe this. And he trashed the story. And I thought, now wait a minute, I'm one of your lead science writers, I am your lead medical writer, and you don't believe my reporting. And it was a kind of awakening that was bolstered by a lot of other things that were going on at the same time, where I suddenly started saying, now wait a minute, how much of medicine do we take on faith? And it turns out we take an enormous amount on faith. It turns out that if medicine were really scientific, there would be a whole lot of things that we wouldn't do. So this eventually led me to write this book called Overtreated. And when I started writing it in 2005 or 2004, I can't remember, 2004, people would say, what's your book about? And I would say, it's about unnecessary care, unnecessary medical care. And they would look at me like my hair was on fire. What are you talking about? The problem is we don't have enough care. We have all these people who are uninsured, and that's true. We do. We still have a lot of uninsured people who don't have adequate access to care. But at the same time, we are giving a lot of other people all kinds of unnecessary care. So this is kind of a long way of getting around to saying that that science, medical science in particular, but I think all of science, is driven to some extent by preconceived notions about how the world works. And in medicine, we can look back in medicine historically, and we often like to laugh at what people used to think was scientific. I mean, bleeding was the most popular treatment there was for about 2 centuries, and it was based on this notion that there were 4 humors that caused disease, and one of them was excess blood. And so one of the ways to get rid of disease was to get rid of the excess blood. And it seemed like a perfectly rational way of seeing the world. Well, we are still doing that today in medicine. And so an enormous amount of medicine is grounded in bad science. And the key for me is that it is also a gigantic industry. We spend more on health care than we spend on anything else. We spend more on health care than we spend on food. We spend more on health care than we spend on defense. We in the United States spend more per capita on health care than the Chinese spend per capita on everything. So this is a huge industry. And it is an industry that depends on the perception of science being the underpinning for it. And so increasingly what I've been interested in and have written about is the lack of really good science in medicine, and how we get fooled by poor science, and how physicians are not all that well trained to really tell the difference between good science and bad science. And so from my perspective, the denialism of science, often people who criticize things in medicine are portrayed as deniers. So I've been portrayed as a denier because I've written about the poor evidence for flu vaccine, for example. And, you know, portrayed as a denier is a really nice way of saying the kind of attacks that have happened. And so it's very easy to attack somebody who isn't saying what the status quo is in medicine as a denier, as being unscientific, when in fact the science that supposedly is supporting whatever the prevailing view is in any particular area of medicine is not always very good science. So I may have a slightly contrarian view to what we're going to talk about tonight.
Great. Well, I'm Shankar Vedantam. I write for the Washington Post. For between 2006 and 2009, I wrote a column called The Department of Human Behavior. And the idea of the column was to take events that were in the news and try and understand them through the lens of the social sciences. So before I start today, I want to conduct a small experiment with your permission. I want the people in this table, the first corner table over here, to look at those images that are on the wall behind you and tell me, you know, and many of you probably know what this illusion is, but tell me what the left, on the top row, second from the left, what does the image look like? Who does it look like? Second from the left. It's not a trick question, really. Well, there's something wrong with your eyes. So it's a remarkable optical illusion because the people at this table should clearly be seeing Marilyn Monroe, and the people at that table should clearly be seeing Albert Einstein. And if you get close to this, you all will see Albert Einstein, and if you get far away, you all should see Marilyn Monroe. And if you don't, then you should be seeing an ophthalmologist or a neurologist very quickly. And the reason I mention this is first because it's a remarkable optical illusion, but second, it illustrates something that we don't take into account through much of our everyday lives, which is that we have minds that don't perceive reality the way it is, that our minds are shaped by evolution perhaps, to perceive and think about things in particular ways. And there's a reason, if you read the little note to the side of those 8 images, it'll explain to you why our minds see, on one case, Albert Einstein, and the other case, Marilyn Monroe. I mention this because I want to come back to this idea over and over again in the few minutes that I'm going to be talking, because I think it illustrates a much broader phenomenon, which is the way we think about ideas in general, the way we think about policy in general. We sort of talk about climate change or evolution or intelligent design, and we say, how is it possible, how is it conceivable that someone else sitting next to me can look at the very same evidence and reach such diametrically opposing conclusions? And when we see this happen, we invariably draw conclusions which say, this person is idiotic, this person is stupid, this person can't know what they're doing. But much of the time, what's really happening are mechanisms in our own mind that cause one of us to perceive Albert Einstein and the other of us to perceive Marilyn Monroe. Now, this has huge ramifications in every realm of public policy, because if we can't agree not on what to do, but on just the basic facts of what we are seeing, discussion about policy becomes impossible. The very first point I want to make in sort of this issue of denialism is I think we should come up with a nomenclature of denialism. There's denialism and there's denialism. Now, if I see a person standing right in front of me here, dressed in white, wearing a blue hat, you know, that's a form of denialism, but it's psychotic behavior, right? There's no person standing in front of me. So that's one kind of, and there are people who believe those things, and those people should be treated with antipsychotic medications. Now, there's another kind of denialism, which is you look at the evidence for climate change and you say, I don't believe it exists, all right? And then there's a denialism which says, I look at the data that I have for the Holocaust, which happened 50 years ago, and I don't believe the Holocaust exists. And there are thousands and perhaps millions of people who believe the Holocaust didn't exist, just as there are millions of people who don't believe the data on climate change. Now, one of those events took place in the past, and one of those events is unfolding as we're going right now and involves projections into the future. And I think these are two different kinds of denialism. And I think the denialism of events that are in the past, which have the kind of evidence that we know has happened, is a much worse form of denialism than the denialism that says, I'm not willing to trust projections about what's happening 30 or 40 years ago. I'm not making a case against global climate change. I'm just saying these are two different kinds of denialism, and we need to think about them differently. When it comes to denialism of things that are happening, such as climate change, one of the things that we're being asked to do is we're often being asked to trust the data rather than our intuitions. When it comes to believing in the Copernican theory, for example, it involves trusting data over our intuition. Because our intuitions do tell us that the sun does rise in the east every day and set in the west. It's not unreasonable to believe that the sun revolves around the earth because that's what we see every day. And yet when we all now believe that that's not the case, and it's an example of how we are persuaded by the evidence rather than our eyes, right? We're trusting the evidence rather than our eyes. And when we're asking people to trust the evidence on global climate change, that's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to trust the evidence on something that's immensely complicated over what they perceive to be happening in their own lives. Some winters are bad, some winters are warm, some summers are warm, some summers are cool. There's conflicting information. And so I think we need to have a nomenclature of denialism before we can have an accurate description of it, because I don't think these phenomena are all identical. Chris mentioned his criticism of the Enlightenment, and I completely share in his view. I think one of the central underlying problems we have in our discussion is that we're starting with this Enlightenment view that we are rational creatures, that rationality wins, that central to what all of us do every day in our lives is that we are rational. Now, I think there are several small warehouses of evidence that show this is simply not the case. And it's not just the case in Oklahoma and Texas, it's not the case in Cambridge either. And I think we need to give up on this idea of rational man, because so long as we believe in rational man, then we're going to be looking at these people who don't believe the data and we say, what can conceivably be wrong with these people? Maybe they should be given antipsychotic medication. Maybe we should be treating the water in Oklahoma with Risperdal. Just put Risperdal in the water supply en masse. Shannon probably won't think too much of that given her concerns about overtreatment. Now, one of the very interesting things about denialism is its connections with partisanship. Why is it that there is such a strong correlation between partisan belief and belief in climate change, or belief in evolution? And why has this changed over time? So in other words, there are far more people today who disbelieve the reality of climate change than was the case 2 or 3 years ago. And I think almost all of that can be attributed to partisanship. Much more than misinformation on the internet, it's partisanship, which is that Republicans feel, conservatives feel, my team does not believe in climate change. And if I'm a good, loyal member of my team, then I can't believe in climate change either. And I think a lot of Democrats believe in climate change, not because they've read the IPCC reports, but because being on the Democrats' team means that you believe in climate change. So in other words, it's an unscientific view as well. It happens to be right, I think. But it's still an unscientific view because it's not based on carefully weighing the evidence, but just knowing which side you're on. And I think a large amount of what's happening in our lives is based on this idea of knowing which side you're on, and then essentially buying en masse the views of that entire side. One of the interesting strands of research that's been done on partisanship has looked at the effects of hypocrisy. And it finds that Democrats are almost completely oblivious to hypocrisy when it's being practiced by Democratic presidential candidates or Democratic politicians. And Republicans are completely oblivious to hypocrisy when it comes to Republican hypocrisy. And so when it comes to George Bush spending enormous amounts of money on the Iraq war, the fact that conservatives are supposed to be for fiscal conservatism isn't seen, there's no contradiction that's perceived. Because again, your loyalty fundamentally is not to the truth, your loyalty is to your team. I'm a loyal fan of the Philadelphia Eagles, which is a ridiculous thing to do in any case. But I'm a loyal fan of the Philadelphia Eagles, and it makes no sense because it's just a bunch of highly paid guys who are wearing, a set of jerseys. The fact that I'm loyal to them makes no sense, right? But I am fanatically loyal to them. They are my team. And I think this effect of teams is far more pervasive than just in sports. In fact, if we think about how we think about sports across the board in the way we think about politics, we actually will have much better insight into how our country works and why it is some messages get through and some messages do not. Another really big factor is the issue of loyalty, and that's the loyalties we have to one another. The fact that Chris's grandfather was an evolutionary biologist is an important reason why Chris believes in evolution today. All right? The fact is we have personal relationships to people, and our personal relationships to people play decisive roles in the beliefs that we come to hold ourselves. So if you're a parent of somebody who's given their child an MMR vaccine, and 6 days later that child develops symptoms that eventually get diagnosed as autism, the fact that there are several well-controlled scientific experiments that show that there is no link between vaccines and autism asks that parent to make a choice between what they perceive to be their loyalty to their child and their loyalty to the evidence. And when you ask people to make that choice, people invariably go with their loyalties to those whom they love. And this is true of the people in Iran who disbelieve that the Holocaust happened, because they're not disbelieving it because they're idiots or because they're stupid people, but because their loyalties to one another predetermine in very powerful ways what they're willing to believe and what they're not willing to believe. Many years ago, there was a psychologist called Lee Ross at Stanford University who conducted an experiment among Israelis and Arab partisans, and he showed them identical video clips from ABC News about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And he asked each of these groups of people to count very carefully the number of negative references they heard to their own side. And he found that the Arabs found incredibly large numbers of anti-Arab references in the news clips, and the Israelis who looked at the very same news clips found incredible number of anti-Israeli references in the very same news clips. And very much like Chris mentioned a moment ago, the people who were the most educated about foreign affairs, the people who knew the most about what was happening in the Middle East, were most likely to overcount what they perceived to be negative references to their own side. And the reason this happened, Lee Ross dubbed this the hostile media effect. That is, we all believe the media is hostile to our groups and our interests, is that when we have strong loyalties to someone, we are incredibly aware when people say negative things about us. So if you stood up here and 100 of you said wonderfully nice things about me, and 10 of you said terribly nasty things about me, when I go home at night, I'm not going to remember the 100 nice things that were said about me. I'm going to remember the 10 negative things that were said about me. So our minds are disproportionately vigilant to negative information when it comes to ourselves or those whom we love. And so when it comes to how Republicans are perceiving how they think about climate change, what's happening is that they're perceiving this as an attack on them. They're not perceiving this as being a discussion about the evidence. They're perceiving it as an attack on them. And to some extent, controversial idea maybe, Michael and Chris may be part of the problem because they're spending their time attacking Republicans. And so in their reaction to what's happening...
Excuse me, I attack Democrats
way
more than Republicans.
All right, fair enough. Okay.
I don't.
Those are the people who love organic food.
Fair enough.
Take their
I
vitamins.
speak to my team.
Republicans don't eat antioxidant formulas.
I'll mention one other idea and then I'll stop, which is the whole idea of misinformation. One of the common beliefs we have is that good information drives bad information out of circulation. It turns out this is not true. Good information does not drive bad information out of circulation. And not only does it not do this, strangely, paradoxically, and horrifyingly, good information sometimes can amplify the effects of bad information. And so when you look at what happened in the 2008 presidential election and you ask yourself, why is it that millions of Americans today believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, despite all the evidence that was put out there, despite all the fact-checking blogs that said, here's a PDF file of the birth certificate, here's what the Republican governor of Hawaii says, etc., etc., etc. And when you ask why it is, it explains to you that good information does not drive bad information out of circulation. There have been very interesting experiments conducted among both Republicans and Democrats showing that when you provide, for example, there was a big controversy when Newsweek a few years ago ran a cover story, or I don't know if it was a cover story, but they ran a story about prisoner abuse in Guantanamo that turned out to be false. Right? So that US Marines had flushed a Koran down a toilet. It created a huge amount of controversy. Newsweek eventually retracted the claim. When Democrats read the information about the mistreatment of prisoners, their views about what was happening in Guantanamo Bay became significantly worse than it was before. When the information was corrected by Newsweek itself, so the source of the information is telling you the information I gave you last week was wrong, many of the Democrats accepted their information was wrong, that the earlier information was wrong, but their attitudes about what was happening in Guantanamo Bay remained extremely negative. In other words, even when good information can correct bad information, it may not correct the bad attitudes that are produced by bad information. And finally, when Republicans were told about, there's a common theory among many conservatives that tax cuts increase revenues. I've never quite understood it, but a large number of conservatives believe that if you cut taxes, revenues go up. Now, about 32% of conservatives believe this, and when psychologists ran an experiment where they provided Republicans with this information about tax cuts increasing revenue, and then provided a refutation to that information by Bush administration economists, all right, very persuasive evidence, twice as many Republicans now believed that tax cuts increase revenue after hearing the refutation. And so when we're thinking about how we are confronting bad information, we're confronting denialism, many of the conventional techniques we employ are not only useless, I would argue they're actually counterproductive.
Okay. So now we're going to start into dialogue, starting with Chris on the end, who's going to discuss a little bit, have a question, and then questions from the floor. We have a microphone right over here. And so, Chris.
Well, we had a lot of ideas, a kind of potpourri of ideas, and I would start by saying I'm in violent agreement with everybody on the panel. But I think I started out more in science writing 25 years ago in the belief in kind of if we just explain things more carefully and better, that people will believe it and change their behavior. And there were surveys when I was covering environment in the 80s showing, if you've got expert views and public views about what the greatest risks in the environment would be, or just greatest risks in general, the lists were completely different. And of course, the experts were more worried about many of the voluntary behaviors, and the public was often worried about a small amount of chemical in apples or trace products that pose far less risk. And looking into that in that data, risk assessment, the science, risk management, what politicians and experts do about it, and risk perception, in the end I was fairly convinced that risk, I'm going to vote with, not just because he's right to my right, but that risk perception is really, really important to take into account. I think also another point, talking to scientists, and I've been very concerned about the growing anti-science attitude, been writing about climate change, and I've been surprised. I thought once the IPCC reports came out, we could say there was a scientific consensus and we would move on to what I thought would be more contentious about what to do about it. And it turns out, actually, as John Holdren, now the science advisor, when he was at the Belver Center, said, if you don't believe in something or believe it's happening, you don't have to do anything about it. So I think one of the things that sort of the elephant in the room, and I'm not talking about the Republican elephant in the room, what's changed? What's different? Why did climate change attitude shift so dramatically? And I think that I'd like to kind of have the panel think a little bit, and I'm surprised actually Chris didn't bring it up. He is a blogger, but the blogosphere, I think many of us have been surprised at the speed over the last 2 years in which these opinion blogosphere sources have gathered so much strength and so much more force at the same time that the mainstream media was losing force. And what we find really is that so many people, and it's sort of been said, but I think the blogosphere and the viral nature has made this happen even more quickly, is that people go to channels of information, and now those channels are very deep. They just hear things that reinforce their views, but they're getting it very quickly, and they're not having it countered by other sources of information.
So the question is something about, why did we change? Is it the blogger's fault? What were you going to say?
About that?
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is...
I could speak about anything, but I don't quite get the question.
No, the question is really just addressing the rapid speed with which the blogosphere has taken over as a source of information for many people, combined with the fact that people are looking for authority figures that coincide with, as been said, their partisan politics and other things.
Blogosphere, but Chris should talk about the blogosphere, but I just want to say one thing that everyone can safely disagree with. This is not a Republican and Democratic issue. It isn't. It's an emotional issue, it's a psychological issue, it's an issue of perception and risk, but it isn't about how you vote. I'm sorry, it's not, because it is true. The idiots on organic food are just as idiotic And the ones who don't vaccinate, the better educated you are, the less likely you are to vaccinate your children. So this is not an issue where we can just sort of assign political spectrums. We can't. It's crazy.
But
I've
Michael,
decided-
just one thing on that before you say that. I think it depends on the issue. There's no question, what Chris said, that on climate change, the #1 predictive factor is your partisan politics
All
in
I'm
the party.
saying is you can't just say Republican, Democrat. Republicans think a certain way, Democrats think a certain way. They all think idiotic ways about different issues.
Right. So you want to defend bloggers now?
No, no.
No,
it's
no,
just
he's
so
not
funny
a
that you bring
defender.
this up because we're having
Yeah.
this event at the Kennedy School on Friday, which is really about this, about how blogs are taking over. There's no norms for what's, how one should
That's
behave.
why I'm feeding this right
Oh,
to
thank
you, Chris.
I mean, I meant, maybe I blew through it too fast, but I think that the changing, media sphere is in combination with the nature of the human mind, which was described much better by my fellow panelists than me. The two are working together to reaffirm people's presuppositions. The nature of the information exchange is so different. It moves really fast. Information shorn of context is flitted around rapidly. And so you have something like ClimateGate, where people, get a quote, a small quote from an email out of context, and suddenly they're really riled up and they go on the warpath. And I think that, a key chapter in that whole story is the rise of several conservative blogs on climate change. Mark Morano's blog, What's Up With That, which is the leading anti-global warming blog, and Stephen McIntyre's Climate Audit, all of which are incredibly widely read, incredibly powerful, and they nitpick the science of global warming. And they really, I think they, and then the stuff bubbles up to Fox News, they ate the lunch of the whole climate science community and really destroyed them. And it's a very powerful lesson in not only how people don't make up their minds based upon the evidence, but in how, if you want to defend science and reason, then you better get really attuned to what's happening out there.
Either of the other panelists want to say something on this before we throw it out?
Well, I just wanted to mention one quick thing, which is that, when you think about how your loyalties to teams work, one of the things that's very striking is if you look at the range of issues that Republicans believe in and the range of issues that Democrats believe in, many of these issues have nothing to do with each other, right? There's no reason why somebody who is against abortion should also be for gun rights. There's no reason why somebody who's for gun rights should also believe in fiscal conservatism. What's interesting about all these issues is how completely unrelated they are. They're all completely unrelated. And yet, when you look at Democrats and Republicans as a whole, what's astonishing is how much they agree on all of these issues that they disagree with each other, right? Democrats invariably will be against, gun rights, invariably will be pro-choice, invariably will believe in climate change. And the fact that all of these beliefs that are unrelated, these issues are unrelated to each other, but the fact these beliefs are moving in lockstep tells me that it's not the beliefs and not the issues itself that's driving it. Because if it was, then you would find far more disagreement and disengagement among Democrats and Republicans than you actually do.
Before we turn it over, and I know some people have to leave, could we have the panel address a little bit on the solution side? Again, we did hand-wringing on future of science journalism. We've done that. How do we get beyond the hand-wringing on this to get people better informed more about the process of science? Because you're citing facts that they don't know. That's not what I'm concerned about. I think people don't know.
Well, one thing that we're overlooking is the institution called schools. Because people are not taught science. They're not taught literacy. They're not taught statistics. My kid is a teenager. She's taking physics. She's not going to be a physicist. I want her to take statistics. I want her to know that every number has a numerator and a denominator. So if there's a risk, there's also a benefit. The risk is is it 1 out of 1? Is it 1 out of 1 billion? Because it matters, but nobody ever talks about that stuff. And so an education might be a place to start.
Schools?
I think that
You too on
I'll
schools?
take it.
I totally agree that one of the central problems is that there's something in medicine called evidence-based medicine, but in fact it's eminence-based medicine. So we tend to believe experts because we don't, and this is understandable because actually taking the time to actually look at data is really hard. But even simple statistics are beyond the average American. And so I would argue exactly the same thing. By the time you get out of high school, you should have had statistics, basic statistics class, so you can know what a big denominator and a small numerator really means, or the reverse.
I would just say I think we should try and find ways to make these issues not partisan. Because in the end, it doesn't really matter whether you're Republican or Democrat if global climate change is real. It's going to affect you, it's going to affect your kids, it's going to affect your grandkids. And the more we think about this through a partisan lens, I think the more problematic it becomes. Because I think, you know, I don't mean to pick on you, Chris, but we're friends, and so I feel like I can. You know, I think Republicans feel that if they believe in climate change, they're going to let Chris Mooney win. And they don't want Chris Mooney to win because he's not on their team. And the point is, it's not about Chris Mooney. Right? It's not about them. It's not about whose team you are and whether you like the person or whether you like the don't like the person. If this is going to affect your life, then this is something that you need to take seriously.
The warring tribes have to talk, or something like
Otherwise, Chris
I think
Mooney
we're missing
wins.
something. The reason this discussion is going in the way that it is which is good, I think, is that the community of people who care about science and reason on this up here, I mean, we're also drawing upon another core body of reasoned information, which is social science research, public opinion research, political science research about how people think and make decisions. If the hard scientists who cared about avoiding science-centered controversies or managing them were in better dialogue with the social scientists who were giving us all these things about why people aren't rational and why they don't make up their minds the way scientists expect them to, if they were on the same team, and if they were on the same team before the issues exploded, which never happens, except it actually happens with the National Nanotechnology Initiative that NSF funds, because it was deliberately set up that way, to have hard scientists and social scientists working together. If that were done more frequently, then I think that we would probably be able to avoid some problems.
Let's start taking questions from the audience. Anybody?
You've been talking a lot about Democrats and Republicans, and I'm just wondering if we can broaden this, because climate change actually occurs in more than just America, the debate. It is about a global phenomenon. So I'm wondering if, two parts to the question. If we look at England, for example, and the Liberals and Tories and the Conservatives, who are debating much these days, are we finding the same kind of partisan breakdown where we look internationally, the Christian Democrats in Italy, I mean, as opposed to the socialists? And what about countries where there isn't so much partisanship? What about Russia, where it's less of a partisanship issue and more of an authoritarian, or, to any country that's like that? And then I guess the corollary to that would be to look back, say, to the 1940s or 50s when science certainly existed. But was it always a partisan issue like this, or was there a time in which that change happened where it became much more about partisanship and much less about science? So it's sort of two parts, but I think they're related.
I've read stories about different attitudes on these issues in different countries, in particular in China, where there isn't that resistance to the idea that climate change is serious. So I think it is different in different countries.
Well, and I think in the U.S., the climate change is, the attitudes is similar in England and Canada and less so in the rest of Europe. Europe is much more hysterical about genetically engineered foods,
Right.
and they don't understand why Americans don't believe in evolution, because it's a much less religious environment. So in terms of developing countries, it's a little harder to get any good data. So, but the one encouraging thing is there's more people writing about these issues. I guess I'm hoping we'll get a little back to the topic of the media and the role, if we can. But
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing on the partisanship issue. When Eisenhower was president, his science advisor, I forget his name, but his number, he was it Vannevar Bush or? But whoever it was when he left office, he was the science advisor, and the number two was whoever he was. They just switched jobs when Kennedy took over, and the number two became the science advisor. That could never happen now. They'd be arrested. I mean, there wasn't this kind of partisanship. I'm not saying there wasn't partisanship, but it was never, at least science used to be a thing that you know, especially with physics, it had a factual basis, it had research, it could be right or wrong, it needed to be proven and repeated, but it wasn't Republican. Molecules aren't Democrats, they're not liberals.
And we are in an era that is extremely partisan. My reading of history, the last time we had a time like this was 1890 to 1900. It was really extreme, and it did go away at a certain point. And we have another question.
I can't second enough what you said, Chris and Shanker, which is that there are volumes of evidence from sciences that come from the social sciences that help us understand how people interpret facts into what they define as truth. Isn't it arrogant, in the purest Enlightenment sense, to deny that evidence and fail to recognize it and incorporate it into communicating about science, policies that are based on science? Isn't it a little bit short of the Enlightenment ideal to leave that chunk of the evidence out? It's not as though it's not out there.
Can
Absolutely, yeah.
I address that very briefly, though? The idea that non-scientists are interpreting evidence through their own lens. Scientists interpret evidence through their lens as well. Science moves in different intellectual directions based on what people perceive reality to be. And many people that we think of as being scientific interpret things through their own lens. And so it's not the exclusive province of the lay people to interpret things the way they want to.
Scientists are people too.
Right. Mostly, yes. No, I'm
We have
kidding.
another question over here.
Yeah, I'd like to address my question to the entire panel. What is the relationship between scientific disinformation and religion or religious doctrine? It seems to me that if religion has a monopoly over truth, then what is the need for science or research?
And you want to take that?
Science is supposed to be verifiable.
Yeah.
Yeah, religion is about belief. Science is theoretically about facts. But I also don't believe
No,
that they have to be different. I don't.
I don't think science is about facts. Science
said
is
theoretically.
it's a way of knowing. It's a way of probing how the world works. And it's supposed to be verifiable. You're supposed to be able to find out if your ideas about how the world works really are predictable. Whereas religion is such a completely different way of knowing the world.
And science doesn't really cover much of the universe because we can only verify so much. We've gotten pretty far, but there's a whole lot that is unverified. And
But if you try to understand why people believe and they have such resistance, when you confront them with a lot of data and facts, religion
Well,
comes-
there's some things we need to Google here. You need to Google Evangelical Climate Initiative, and you need to Google Clergy Letter Project. And in each case, what you have is, strong religious believers supporting action on climate change, supporting the teaching of evolution. So, yes, the new atheists hate me when I point things like this out. It turns out that there are some ways in which religious views contradict science, basically if you hold them as a fundamentalist. And then there's all this dramatic diversity in religion and all these other different positions in between. And so religion turns out to be very diverse and complicated. And it doesn't necessarily lead to being misaligned with science. It all depends on what kind of religion it is.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's kind of an easy thing to say religion is in opposition to science. I think for the most part, I think that is probably true with fundamentalists. But for most people on Earth, it just isn't the case, and it never has been.
One other point. I think, again, we're falling into the trap that many of us criticize in terms of how journalism is done, which is the dueling experts on both ends. I really think the truth is that many people are in the middle, kind of the confused middle, and the media has not done a very good job of trying to explain not facts, but the process of science. Now, granted, people haven't learned it in school, but I think when we get into this us versus them, or people do the classic dueling scientists, dueling experts, we're now got dueling parties. I think most people, and all these surveys show, the strongly held beliefs are at both ends of the spectrum, and in the middle is a kind of fluid group that may be influenced somewhat by information, and if they knew more about the science process, they might be able to sort it out, because science is really not about facts, it's about challenging facts and the process. So I just hope we don't get too much into this us and them dueling everything.
Are there more questions?
Hi, so I just wanted to comment on the earlier point about different countries, because I'm from the UK, so I just wanted to comment on the fact that climate change isn't a political issue so much in the UK. What it's come down to, the big problem, is the uncertainty, and the fact that scientists really struggle to get across the uncertainty of forecasts and predictions, and that's been the really big problem in the climate debate in the UK. But the one thing I wanted to comment on is, from my experience in the UK, it doesn't necessarily need to be about education at school. There's actually a real public appetite for understanding how scientists reason something through. And we've actually done a lot of work, the organisation I work for, to popularise peer review. And actually we find that it's something that really helps people, from things like our doctors, our NHS helplines, to our patient groups. And I just wondered the sort of panel's perspective from what you think there is a potential to really equip the public to make sense of science through giving a better understanding of how science works.
You know, one of the things that I'm this perhaps goes back to an earlier question as well, which is that the interesting question is why some issues become partisan in some countries and not in others. And I think it really is an interesting question. I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that. But given that the issue is partisan in the United States, climate change, and it's not partisan in the UK, and given that we all generally, I think, would agree that we'd be better off if the issue were not partisan, how do we get from here to there? Which is, you know, if there is a partisan debate going on, if there is sort of conflict going on, and you sort of recognize the conflict as inappropriate, walking away from the field doesn't actually do much. Because what happens when you walk away from the field is that the other people don't stop playing. You know, they're still going to be playing, and they're still going to think of this as being a conflict that they've just happened to have won. So I think the real tricky question is, how do you sort of de-escalate a conflict when you are one of the players in that conflict? You know, this is true not just of us, but if you think about what's happening in the Middle East and any number of geopolitical conflict situations, how do you de-escalate the conflict when you are one of the players in that conflict? Because when you escalate it, you're escalating the fight. When you walk away, the other side perceives it as being a victory. How do you sort of find a way to walk away without saying that I've given up the fight? I'm sort of more of a question than an idea.
You send Al Gore to hang out with the climate bloggers that I talked about, and I don't know if he'll go.
Question from Ted.
I wanted to, thank you. This is going to be a bit sloppy, so bear with me here. When I was growing up, it seemed to me that the argument was always, well, what are we going to do about this? And the this was sort of agreed upon. Now there's an antecedent reference problem. We don't know what the this refers to. I seem to remember growing up in a culture of facts, and the notion that facts were sacrosanct. And it was certainly, it permeated journalism and so many other cultures. What we're talking about tonight is science, but it also has to do with the economy and so many other areas. There's a kind of repudiation of the sanctity of facts today. We don't live in a culture of facts anymore, I think. And you know, I don't know if it's because, to some degree, we live in a vastly more diverse America than the America that I grew up in. That might be a part of it. I don't know. But as a journalist, I certainly subscribe to the temple of facts. But I'm a whole lot less cocky about them now than I was then. And I just would like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yes?
It changed. It did change. I really believe that it changed. I think it changed because the media changed, and I think it changed because American politics changed, and I think it changed also because some very savvy people became cleverly aware of the fact that it works to fight facts. But it works to counter facts. This is the tobacco strategy, and we know what they said in their papers, and they deliberately tried to do it. Yeah.
It also changed because scientists fucked up, because corporations lied, because we didn't get what we expected, because we heard the words Chernobyl, and we heard Vioxx, and we heard all these things, and we went from blindly believing that these people created things that were good for us to maybe blindly believing that all they care about is profit. And some of that, maybe a lot of that, is understandable. And it would be crazy not to acknowledge that there's some fault here that people deserve to have.
I have to say, I don't think I quite agree that our perception of facts has changed. I don't think we've ever been, if you buy the idea that the Enlightenment was wrong, that we're not rational creatures, our irrationality didn't begin in 1989. Our irrationality has been around for a very, very long time. I mean, to state the obvious, this is a country that said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and then had slavery for 200 years.
But
there is sort of a cognitive disconnect, if you will.
America after Sputnik was a different America with respect to science than America today. I mean, the reasons are very complicated. You can do a whole book about it. I did several half chapters about it and just flew right through. But something changed. Something changed there. From everyone rallying behind the space race, I think it was the coolest thing ever. And you can see it in polls. People don't believe anymore that scientific achievements are the country's top achievements. People don't list the moon landing as one of the most important
things. The two things are not really different necessarily. You can have hot periods and cold periods in partisanship, and we're still irrational at the bottom.
Yeah, and people believe in the moon landing not because it was science, but because it was the way to say America was #1.
And also because we were scared of the Russians.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's not about facts.
But it wasn't just like an intellectually cool thing. We were in a war.
Marie.
Yes, I wanted to suggest that maybe this distrust of science has a positive aspect to it. I'm slightly agreeing with Michael. After the 60s, we came to understand that knowledge is power, and that we need to sometimes question the hegemony of those who were in control of knowledge. And the whole postmodern thing, the whole idea that we understood that there was social context. Thomas Kuhn teaching us that scientists too were not objective, that they too had colored lenses. So maybe this is a step in the right direction. And to get back to Shankar and the whole idea of team, it's not unexpected that in the end, we try to find comfort and shelter in that group of people who seem to us to be most caring about our own safety, the people that make us feel part of them. And then the only other thing I wanted to say, again, to Shankar is, George Lakoff, the Democrat, tried hard to figure out why is it that Republicans tend to have similar ideas about abortion and gun control and free market economy. And he came up with the best explanation that I've read so far. And he divided us all into those who feel strongly about the strict parent view of the world, and those of us who are in favor of the nurturant, the mommy party people who, the strict parent believes it's a tough world out there. We have to be competitive. Free market is correct. We have to protect our women. And the nurturing parent, the leftist side, feels that we're all equal. We have to support each other. And he did a great job showing how if you divide the world in those two teams, you can really explain a lot of the positions of the right and the positions of the left. Anyway, I just wanted to suggest that it's a good thing that we're questioning the lenses of those people in authority. And, I'm a child of the 60s, and I don't regret it.
I want to second that position from my perspective as a medical journalist. Is I've seen a shift over the last decade, which I think is for the better, because I spent a lot of time writing about how great the newest thing was in medicine. And it was, in fact, cheerleading without really understanding what was going on. And I think that greater skepticism on the part of journalists is incredibly important, both in medicine but also in the hard sciences as well. To understand the context in which the science is being done within the larger society and what it really means for that society and who pays for it. It is crucially important in medicine to know who pays for it.
One of the paradoxes, though, again, none of this fits into easy boxes. A Gallup, I think it was Gallup or Harris poll last summer, if you look at who Americans admire most, who do you think #1 is?
Not journalists.
No, number one, firefighters number one, but number two, scientists number two, doctors number three, nurses number four, teachers in the top five, and yes, journalists down at the bottom, just above, real estate agents number, at the lowest, bankers a little up. So
that may have shifted a little.
Well, it may have shifted, but there's been a consistency. People may not like the products of science, they may not understand it, and yet scientists still have a lot to build on. They're always hand-wringing about how everyone doesn't agree with them. It's we in journalism who have a lot of work to do, really, to do a better job and maybe get ourselves up from the basement a little bit.
Marissa.
Chris talked about the blogosphere and how we all, and I think all of us in this room are guilty of it, sort of seek out the places where our own opinions are already affirmed. But I'm wondering if the panel, especially those who work in traditional media, can talk about the journalistic convention of on the one hand, on the other hand, and how that may have contributed to...
I'll be happy to talk
where you feel compelled to say there's a controversy in the scientific community where perhaps there is not?
Yeah, it's one of the most damaging and idiotic things in the history of the dead tree media, which I'm a representative of. The idea that, and I'll tell you, once when I was a reporter at the Washington Post, I was writing a story about some important AIDS initiative. I was probably interviewing you, and it was a front page story, and it was 6 o'clock, and my boss was like, "Are you done yet?" And I said, "Well, I haven't heard back from Dannemeyer, who was a lunatic, fringe, right-wing, gay-bashing congressman in California." And he just looked at me and said, there aren't two sides to every issue. And coming from him, Bob Kaiser, that was quite a statement. But there aren't two sides to every issue. And I think what reporters or journalists are supposed to do is be fair and complete and analytical. And you should read our pieces and know why we make the conclusions we do. But the idea that there are two sides to every issue is just damaging, and it's a waste of people's time. I don't want to read a 10,000-word story that says, well, on the one hand, maybe there isn't climate change. On the other hand, there is. Just pick a lane and be in the lane, and then have the readers decide whether you did a good job or not.
But I'll give you, there's an example that I was recently called by a reporter because now I'm in this sort of weird quasi-expert, I'm a writer, I never write on the one hand, on the other hand stories. Fortunately, I'm lucky enough. But this guy calls me because he wants to know who the experts are on this controversy. And I said, well, let me sort of walk you through what the arguments are and what's really going on here. And he says, no, I really don't have time to understand this. I just need to know.
That's a good reporter.
And he wrote a piece that ultimately, I think, was weirdly biased because he didn't bother to really understand the underlying material.
What's the media trend, though? So we're losing science journalists. That was last year, right? So the remaining ones will know less about science and will be more inclined to do on the one hand, on the other hand, because it's a crutch that you use if you don't know a lot about the topic, is essentially what it is. And that's why it will always exist. Because it'll always be the intern who gets through their first story and they've got 4 hours, they're going to do on the one hand, on the other hand.
It depends on the orientation of the publication.
Well, yeah.
If you're in England or Hong Kong, I was an intern at the Far Eastern Economic Review, I got yelled at for the one hand, other hand Americanness, because you don't have to structure it that way. You do have to structure it so that you're fair and knowledgeable, and that takes a little while to learn how to do.
We have another one over there?
Two things, really. One is we failed to use the gambit that you should always use in these discussions, which is when in doubt, blame it on the lawyers. I date much of this problem, at least symbolically, to the fact of Philip Johnson. If he's the University of California law professor, who a very conservative writer, historian, who got very involved in founding the Discovery Institute and leading the rhetorical charge against evolution and in favor of teaching some form of creationism or intelligent design. And he was he is a smart guy. He's malicious, he's malign, he's a boil on the body politic. But he really set up a form of argument that journalists and scientists especially are very poorly vaccinated against, which is constructing, if you can construct an argument with, quote, evidence, then that has authority, even if it's meaningless or wrong or cherry-picked or just a joke, which creationism and intelligent design for the most part actually is. And that method of arguing, it's a refined version of what Chris was talking about with what the tobacco companies, that you come up with any piece of evidence, say, look at the argument here, this is an advocacy kind of situation. As long as science communication gets involved in some kind of advocacy dispute, it's going to be very, very hard for a clear picture of what the science is actually saying to come through. I don't know what the solution is, but it seems to me that it's one of the big, problems in the
education.
I disagree.
Yes, education, except we've been doing that. Since Sputnik, we've been saying we've got to improve the education. So
well, we can say it. But the point is we haven't done it. If people had a brain, if they were able to make decisions independently, then they could make their own
not everybody who disagrees with you is an idiot.
But most people are. Just most people.
It's a good default position, but
I told you that Republicans who have more education are more likely to not trust climate change. I mean, the higher their level of education, the less likely they are.
No, I sort of mean specific types. Yeah.
I mean, so it's not just education. I agree, science education is not great, but then you're going to have to deal with all these ideological things that education is not going to do anything.
Okay, maybe we'll take one more.
It might be too late in the evening to shift, but I'm interested in knowing what the panelists see as some of the unfolding stories that are coming up over sort of the coming year that either you're working on or that you think we all should be working on.
It takes me 2.5 years to even formulate an idea. I can't possibly say what I'm working on. But I think the things that are interesting to me and to some others are synthetic biology, the creation of organisms, the programming of life, which has the ability to do some really exciting and some really horrifying things. And we need to sort of figure out how we're going to deal with that, because it's coming. And we need to either get ahead of it or watch out.
I'm fascinated by geoengineering. I think it's coming. It's weird. 2 books just came out about it, and they didn't quite hit a nerve. So most Americans, I think only 3% of Americans when polled know what geoengineering is, and another 20% think it's geothermal energy. So, and then 70% haven't heard of it. It's one of those issues. But I think it's going to explode at some point, and for those who don't know, everybody probably knows what it is, but we're going to fix the climate, by meddling with it further and remaking the stratosphere, because there's no way we're going to fix it by cutting emissions. So we're going to make the planet more reflective of sunlight and just bounce the stuff away. I really think this is likely to happen, and it's only a matter of time, but it hasn't caught on yet.
Nobody ever said human beings were humble. I think small right now. I'm interested in how, and I think there's going to be more and more, there are going to be more stories written about it. It's also a piece of healthcare reform, is how you really help patients understand what trade-offs are in medicine. And it's hard to do. Journalists have a role to play, but it's also a healthcare reform issue that's going to be more and more important.
I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 2 years, and anything I see and think are almost certain to be wrong. I can tell you about a couple of things that I'm interested in working on. I'm interested in sort of the persistence of the effects of inequality in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, and why they continue to have pernicious and pervasive effects. And I'm also interested in the problem of what social scientists call collective action dilemmas, which is sort of what I alluded to a moment earlier, which is when you have 2 sides locked in conflict and both sides know that the conflict is bad for them, how do you de-escalate that? How do you walk away without losing? How do you engage and move from rancor to engagement?
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for coming. We have coffee to go over here on the side, just in case you need to be revived. And thank you very much.